Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today on our LinkedIn Live. We are also streaming live on YouTube and on Facebook. We are talking today to the wonderful Jean Gomes. I'm so excited to have him here, my boss from one of my first consultancy roles and someone I learned a huge amount from. Also founder, entrepreneur of Outside and New York Times best-selling author. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining me here today on the Orange Sofas. I'm really excited to have this discussion and I've just so much to talk about. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Alex.
We are talking about the topic of workplace influencers today and mindsets for influence. There is a lot going on in the world. It feels like micro change, macro change, chaos on so many different levels. And everyone I speak to is trying to make sense of what's happening. And all of these are the types of topics I know we've worked on and been talking about for many years. So I'm keen to explore today with you kind of some of the newer nuances of people operating within organizations and systems, both locally and globally, who are really shifting things. They've got a different mindset. They're really able to influence not just what they do in their role, but in their team and their organization and systems, even outside of organizations as well. And how as kind of consumers and as society, we're looking at influencer as a word that has become everyday language to us in our consumption of kind of social media and looking at different products that we buy as consumers. So how are we adopting, how is that influencing us internally? How are we seeing people internally in organizations as influencers? And are people actually in new generations expecting to see influencers? So many different questions. But, you know, starting with that kind of macro state of the world, where we're at, what's happening? There's so much going on, and trying to make sense of that right now is quite hard, isn't it? I mean,
it is. And I think, you know, the ways of thinking about this, there's lots of different ways in which you can think about it. So one of the things that's happening at the moment is, and it's been happening for a long time, which is we expect the technology that we use at home, which has generally been better than the office because of the whole, you know, slow moving nature of large corporate systems, to be as good as it is at work. And so that has happened. We also expect to be able to self-express. We expect to do all the kind of things that we do in our personal lives. We expect to do those at work now. So as work has demanded more of us, then the things that were once just off limits are now center stage at work. We talk about sleep, we talk about nutrition, we talk about all of these things that 20 years ago would have been stuff you did in your private lives. And that's great. And it also has a number of implications and costs associated with it as well. So there's that going on. There's also, I think, a big shift taking place, which is we're moving out of the knowledge economy, or the knowledge economy is evolving into something else, which is the mindset economy. And that is that your mindset, and I'll come to define that in a moment, is crucial in terms of how you create value, both in terms of your existing skill sets, and then there are going to be new jobs that are coming along. And we were talking about one of them, really, which is mindset dependent. You create value based on your mindset. And that has been a largely intangible thing where people are confused about what they mean by the word. So sometimes they use it to describe personality. When they talk about fixed and growth mindset, they actually mean this person's, negative or pessimistic or, introvert or whatever it is, but they don't really mean what they say they mean. Or they're talking about a social affiliation. They belong to this group. It's the finance mindset, or it's the, it's the salespeople, or whatever it is. So they use it in very loose terms, and that means we can't really do much about it. So I think, my research has been to kind of understand the science of mindset, and there is a new science around this, which moves us beyond just the kind of dictionary definition, or the Carol Dweck growth versus fixed, which is in itself just a part of this. And the way I think about mindset is you have your skills, you have your inner knowledge of yourself, your values, your personality types, and so on. And you have the outer world, you have the expectations, the behavioral expectations of being able to function at work. But you have this thing that sits between them, which is your mindset. And this is like the broker between the inner and the outer world. And that isn't fixed. That changes second by second. It'll change in this conversation. And it's how you feel, think, and see. It's how you frame things. It's the assumptions that come with that. And given the circumstances you find yourself in, how does that make you feel physically and emotionally? And those three things are just constantly swirling around. The more we understand how that influences the way that we look at the world, that the actions and decisions we take, then it becomes an asset to us, and particularly in dealing with uncertainty.
And that, so while you're talking, I'm sitting there thinking about some of the common challenges that people I talk to in organisations are facing currently with people worrying about what they're going to say and not feeling they have influence. And it feels like that spectrum is starting to open up, where people are maybe feeling more permission to speak and influence, maybe feeling invited to, maybe encouraged, maybe even empowered to. And so we've kind of we're coming out of this almost like this dark space of creating psychological safety for everyone to feel comfortable to speak, to really encouraging people to use that mindset to go beyond themselves, to come out of their shell almost, in terms of you don't need to sit and do this one kind of task focused, very skill based role, but actually we need people who can use their humanness. And I talk a lot about that, kind of keeping that human switched on, because where we're almost grappling with and competing with AI and wondering how much AI is going to kind of be absorbed into our roles, actually lots of people don't really feel confident enough to know what the humanness of them is, to know, okay, well, which bit is my bit as a human in this organisation, in this team. And so it feels like that mindset piece really talks to the humanness of knowing who we are, knowing what we can do, knowing how we can influence. And it feels like there's a really big pull for that in organisations right now. Everyone wants people to do that because they want to innovate. So there's this pull for innovation that feels very connected to the mindset.
Yeah. Well, I think, just drawing on a couple of things you said there. One is that organisations want more from people. They always have done, they always will do. The key is, what do they want now? And as things start to become more automated and jobs start to fall away that are repetitive and so on, what you don't want is a vast amount of the population servicing robots. You don't want the equivalent of somebody wandering around in the checkout of your organization, making sure the robots are working. You want people to add more value. And so there is a tendency with technology for us to allow the technology to dictate our focus, our attention, our well-being, all these kind of things. So the things to kind of think about from a personal perspective, if you're thinking about this in terms of what does the next 10 years plus mean to me when in an automated world, what are human beings for? There are 5 things that human beings can do to create value in that automated world. The first is kind of like the most obvious, but probably least talked about, in the sense of it being a need that most organizations meet, which is energy. When our well-being is managed well, we bring energy to a system, to conversations. A bot is never going to do that. AI is never going to do that. And in that energy, the whole range of things that we could talk about. The second is that AI doesn't know what's happening in the world. So situational understanding, recognizing the complexity, being able to use our incredible brains to process that and arrive at understanding of what things are happening, is going to become a skill set that increasingly we need to develop. And most people don't know how to do that very well. The third thing is creative problem solving. People aren't taught how to solve creatively. They're taught to solve logically. They're taught almost to solve on the basis of what the organization has always solved in the past, the way that it thinks. The fourth is judgment and decision making. And again, people aren't taught how to make decisions. No. They learn it kind of by osmosis, by watching other people doing it. But if you ask people to decide, like, what is the decision we're making? They don't know. How to make decisions together, they don't know how to do it. And how do they learn from decisions? They don't know how to learn from decisions often. And the final thing is relationships. How do you inform and enrich and develop relationships? Those are the 5 areas, if like the source of how we're going to create careers for the future, jobs for the future, where the human has the advantage.
Fascinating. So I'm just not going through each of those in my head at the moment. And I think for me, there's one piece there that's very connected to a lot of the discussion I'm hearing around innovation. It feels like we've kind of been stuck for a few years, kind of post-pandemic across the world in organizations, almost dealing with multiple crises over and over again. And it's felt very short-term in kind of strategy planning and looking ahead. People have been looking much shorter term because of the amount of uncertainty and change. And it feels like coming into 2025, people have kind of got used to the amount of change, or they're getting used to the amount of change we're now hit with, and pushing themselves to look much further into the future than we have done over the last few years. So it feels like there's a lot more, to a certain extent, excitement around strategy and future opportunities, as well as that fear that's sitting there as well. But also that real pull and need for people to innovate. So when you talk about that creative problem solving, it really sits in that innovation space for me, because I see that when I talk to people about AI now, loads of people are using typical AI services, and there's little stars that are popping up on all kinds of apps and devices that we have. How much are we already letting go of our creativity and innovation to those bots and assuming that the computers can do it all for us? So, okay, well, I'll type this up and I'll put it into ChatGPT and it'll come up with something much more creative for me. And it's almost like we're defaulting and avoiding the creativity that we could actually have, as I said, from problem solving, but really from actually just looking into the future and imagining new possibilities.
Yeah.
And what's the mindset that we need to be able to do that? I mean, that takes us away from almost leaning on processes and systems, as you said, and leaning on opportunities like new AI coming up to default to, when that's the bit that we should be doing ourselves because we're really good at it.
Yeah, well, I think where we will go, because everybody's in this experimental phase at the moment where they're either avoiding AI, it's like, I don't want to do it, or they're falling into the trap of thinking it can solve everything, and they're seeding their thinking to it. There's a halfway house between this, which is AI will develop as co-intelligence. It will become our extended intelligence. It'll allow us to not have to remember everything and go to resources the whole time, because it kind of understands the past. That's what it does. It understands the past. True innovation doesn't come from that. Creativity doesn't come from that. So the thing that I think we are now kind of trying to think about is not change, but uncertainty. Because if you think about what COVID was, I mean, yes, we had to navigate through all of those different situations and do things in a way that we'd never done before. But what we're really doing was we were breaking down uncertainty. If you were Pfizer and you were trying to launch a product into the market, figure it out, launch it into the market 7 to 8 years faster than anybody had ever done before, and actually save millions of people's lives, or billions of people's lives potentially, then you were breaking down uncertainty. How do we do this? How do we do this the whole time? So the big shift is, I think, it's about what we're not good at is recognizing the difference between risk and uncertainty. So when it comes to creativity, risk is where you can figure out there's a probability that you can attach to an outcome. Uncertainty is where you can't do that. And that's where the most exciting creativity comes from. You can probably break down a lot of the risk using AI models because it's based on stuff that you can see and know and plug into it. When it comes to the other part, that's where you leave the AI behind and use human beings to figure it out.
And that's where I think, you talked about that fifth element around relationships, for me is so critical, fundamental, because that kind of anticipating and predicting the future and looking to see alternative scenarios to be creative and innovate differently. I've certainly from our research, it looks very much like it's going to be more powerful if it's done in social imagination space rather than individual. And yet we're working in more isolated ways than ever before. And imagination and having time to discuss and imagine things, that's something that sounds like a laughable luxury really in organizations, particularly when we're being asked to do more with less and less resource, and the pressures that people are under this year. And that's why I guess I'm coming back to this topic of influencers is, are we going to see, I guess, in 25 and beyond, the rise of workplace influencers? Are we going to see these people starting to stand out beyond titles? So I'm used to working in organizations where we'll talk about sponsors, we'll talk about champions, we'll talk about kind of network groups, resource groups that have been pulled together for a reason, because of their title, because of their experience. But it's very kind of feels like it's very organizational based, even though some of them are volunteers. Whereas I feel like influencers emerge, and they emerge maybe because of their mindset, their ability to see an opportunity, to connect people in a way that other people can't see the connections, and they'll connect, people and things and processes and information and data, and find like this golden thread through things that other people can't see. But the other thing I see them very, very good at doing is taking this huge amount of complexity of information that we're all dealing with and turning it into something really easy and actionable to understand.
Yeah.
And that seems to be like number one thing I recognize in influencers. And how are these people going to be different in organizations from our traditional kind of like, let's onboard our champions and get our early adopters kind of along our change process? How do we help these influencers emerge and be discovered and develop them better in organizations?
Well, the first question you ask is like, is this going to happen? The answer is yes. Corporate communications has long been, like a failing function in most organizations.
But it hasn't been redone for a while.
No, because it's based on a hierarchy.
Yeah.
It comes from the CEO's office down, which is, this is the message. Make sure people. The underlying assumption is if you tell people something, they will hear it and act on it. That's not how human beings work. And so there has been decades and decades of research done by engagement companies saying that communication is the number one thing that people always say in every engagement survey is missing, even in highest performing organizations. They're not talking about communication. They're talking about the relationship they have with people and the needs in that relationship being not met. So when you ask them things like, do you get the information in a timely way? They go, yes, but communication isn't working. So that function isn't working. So it's likely that when people are desperately searching around for an alternative that might is working in the world, they will say yes. I think what we'll find though is that it isn't free money. It's very difficult to make that kind of authentic, the pull that creates from influencers work within your environment, because you have a whole bunch of duty of care. You have, you put people into an influencing environment. Yes, they might get lots of positive, but what about the hate? What happens to somebody if they expose themselves unprepared? They seem to be very confident, and all of a sudden they get a lot of negative feedback, and they are taking disproportionately responsibility for the company outside of their role that they weren't ever anticipating. There's a whole consequence.
Minefield, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think there's going to be different types. So there's going to be people who are brilliant salespeople.
Yeah.
They're great at, like, I've just tried this, and like, this is like changing my life, and I use this process and it's wonderful, and like, this is how you can do it. Those kind of people. Then there'll be people who are naturally the go-to in terms of social connections, the connectors in the organization, and they are brilliant at helping you to navigate like change and to find resources and harness the collective intelligence of an organization. There are going to be people who are great at pattern recognition, and they go like, this is what's happening in the organization. They make sense for it. They create meaning for people. And those are all different forms of inspiration, and they create pull. They create attention because they are able to communicate in very short periods of time very complex messages that are emotional meaning as well as intellectual and rational meaning.
It just, what you said then in terms of the pace and the ability to decipher something quickly and translate reminds me of in an organization I worked where we were launching a new approach to leadership development, and I went to another site to introduce the program, and someone turned around to me and said, "Oh, I think I've already seen this." And they showed me a document, and it was the manager's cheat sheet to the program we just created. And I remember thinking to myself, "That's amazing. Where did you get this?" And we found this person had literally put like the whole kind of nuts of the program and the bolts into this kind of just one pager, this cheat sheet that made it so easy for everyone to understand exactly what they needed to do. And the managers loved it. They absolutely loved it. And I thought that's absolutely brilliant. We need more of those people.
Yeah.
And we need them on board. But you're absolutely right. There's lots of different types of influencing going on here. And I'm interested to know, what potentially are the barriers to developing people like that? When we're thinking this is really useful, this is maybe enhanced internal communications, maybe replacing eventually internal communications, but how can we really discover people in the organization that we can develop and give them more positive platforms to do what they're doing and have broader reach and expansion where they've got that natural tendency. And I just want to ask if anyone's got any comments or thoughts, please do put them into the chat. We're really watching the chat to see if anything comes through. We've got a couple of things here about how does mindset drive influence in the role of internal influencers. Really let us know what you're thinking about the conversation, and if you've got any thoughts or comments. Well, because I get absorbed in the conversation and I'm a bit lost. But I would love to hear what you're thinking about the barriers, particularly. What could the barriers be to us really finding, enhancing, and enabling people to do that role positively?
Well, I think you're trying to make this role successful, or these roles successful in an organisation. So the starting point is to assume you know nothing about how it works. I think that's really important, that you treat it in an experimental way, right. and the bargain set between the audience and the people both doing the influencing and those sponsoring the influencers is that very much this is a provisional thing. We don't know what we're doing, we don't know how it's going to work, and so on. And let's experiment with it, because if you set people up with the expectation that because somebody is an enthusiastic communicator and very good at explaining things, then this is going to work. And it might not work. It might not work for lots of different reasons. You might find that actually the motivation of individuals is not healthy.
Right.
So some people might, like the ego might be the
status
number one reason why somebody's doing it. And that's not a healthy basis. I mean, you need some ego. You need some motivation to do it. You need to want to explain ideas. But actually, the bigger purpose of this is to make the organization come together around things. And you want people to be seeing a bigger picture and have a bigger motivation. You also, one of the biggest barriers in any kind of mindset is a form of zero-sum mindset. It's an either or, you're either this or it's that. So it's me against the organization. And on the face of it, you may not even be aware that that's how you're thinking. So you're the shop steward on behalf of the organization's conscience or something like that. And that will creep out over a period of time. And then eventually it'll become a trap. And the consequence of that is polarization. You do not want influencers generating a polarized version of things, the hierarchical, us against the customer, sales versus marketing, today versus, any of those kind of things. You want them to be encompassing the realities for people in a healthy way.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because I see that happen a lot on social media. I see almost like the influencers who are very good at polarizing, and they really, they hang their hat on that being their thing. Versus those who actually sit really well in the middle of that balance of actually being able to allow a polarized conversation to take place, but just to ask questions that explore that. And that's really much more welcoming. You feel much more included in that conversation to be able to enter into it and share your ideas and thoughts. And I guess that's more what we're looking for in organizations. But would you say that we actually, rather than kind of looking for those natural influencers to emerge and kind of support them to do that positively, that actually it might be more of a whole organizational approach where we're looking to develop the capability for people to be more open to that influencing beyond their role across the whole organization? I mean, would that cause any problems for an organization if everyone was constantly doing that?
We all have we have a finite amount of attention, so we want to be thinking about what is it ultimately solving for, and it's helping the organization adapt to new realities, to be able to embrace uncertainty, to adapt to change, and to be able to move resources and people and ideas against the challenges facing you. So if you think about it like that, you probably want a proportion of the organization engaged in that at any one time. But what's happening now is we're all doing just-in-time learning.
Yeah, 100%.
So I need to figure this out. I need to go into this and so on. So how do influencers help on that? And if you have an AI environment that can, tell me somebody who's solving this particular problem in the organization, or tell me how to get my team orientated around that. And you're able to draw upon people who've got the precise set of coordinates around how to solve that. They've been in this market with these type of people and that situation. That then becomes something that would be really useful. So I would say it's probably, two things. One, to avoid polarization, you need a level of maturity, human development, not to see the world as either or, but both and. And so you want that to be kind of like an underlying dimension of the people you choose. And then you really want to align it with the outcomes the organization's after. How does this help us to win together in terms of the outcomes? Not thinking about it as a series of themes.
So if I think about the common challenges that we get in organizations, particularly with change, which we hear all the time, number one is how can I get people to feel more positive? I've got all these people with such a negative mindset. They all think the change is awful. I can't get them through it. They're avoiding talking about it, and I'm trying it in the best way possible with all my change management process in place. Can you really shift someone if they're in a negative mindset? And if that's happening at scale, it's even harder, isn't it? How do you help shift it at scale?
So I think mindset has to be separated from a number of things, because this is where you look at the idea of somebody having a fixed versus a growth mindset, or just a fixed mindset around things. And people never have a completely fixed mindset. So you might have personality types that are particularly resistant to change, or you might have somebody who has a skill set that ultimately means they're going to leave the organization because it's no longer wanted. And they know that, but it's not being spoken about. They can feel their value, diminishing within the context of a strategy and so on. That's nothing to do with mindset. That is a natural reaction to them, losing their economic worth within the situation. So we need to pull these things apart and go, well, what is mindset? Mindset is self-awareness. It's the ability to be able to triangulate between what's happening in the world, what's happening within you physically, emotionally, and then your capacity to strategically evaluate those things, use metacognition to be able to think about your thoughts, and to use those things to help you to orientate yourself to a helpful, healthy relationship with the circumstances you're in. And to answer your question around change, the thing that I think is missing, if you look at the research into mindset and change, people have a focus on mindset in transformational efforts. It's a 400% better result than when they just focus on behavior and communications and strategy. So clearly it makes a big difference. Why does it make a difference? I think in part is because you're locating control to the individual. The individual kind of navigates it rather than it constantly being something that's being done to me.
Yeah.
And so one way of regaining control, which is never talked about, is that most change programs say, this is where we are, this is where we want to be, this is how we're going to get there. And that is all actually based on a way of thinking about the future, which is goal forward. The problem with that is that we have a psychological relationship with the future, which is very strange. We treat our future selves and our organizational future as if they were a stranger. So all the psychological research shows that when you treat somebody as a stranger, you don't look after their interests, which is bizarre.
It is.
So the way to break that cycle and to get better change and to create a mindset that adapts into the future is to go into the future and ask, what does the future want of me now? And that two-way dialogue is the way that you break down change in a way that puts people in control.
I love that, because it's stepping yourself into that visualization of where am I going to be? What does that require of me? Exactly that to get to. And it gives a much better pathway, because otherwise you're thinking about the goal from where you are currently, aren't you? Rather than
it's difficult to do that.
It is.
It's difficult to do it because we're not encouraged to do it. It's kind of regarded as, like imagination is not something organizations do, but every strategic transformation is an act of imagination, which is seldom talked about. The second thing is that when you do talk to your future self, the advice of what it gives you, what it sends back from the future, is always unpalatable. It's always about moving out of your comfort zone. It's always about doing the thing, taking the path of least resistance. No, you can't do that. It's about the hard parts of the hard problem. And people don't want to do that if they can avoid it. And if organizations encourage them to avoid that by just pedaling faster, a lot of transformational efforts are actually just people trying to do things faster and more intensely. That's never going to do it, because you're not actually solving the problems of the future. You're solving the problems of today.
Yes, we are. And, everyone's in that situation right
Yeah.
now. I see everything. Just how can we do more with less and faster? But we've been saying that for years. But it feels like now, and I'm really, we're seeing the rate of burnout, absolutely through the roof. It is really going at such a pace. I do worry that we actually cannot go any faster. And I'm speaking to people who've got, 300, 400 emails in their inbox. And some of those might be really important. So they have to go through them on a daily basis to ensure that they're not missing something that's critical to their role.
Yeah.
You can't function like that if you're in back-to-back meetings.
No, well, that's an existential crisis, isn't it?
Really
if
crazy.
if you think about that over the course of your life, you're going to be generating gigabytes of what Al Gore called exformation, information that you'll never look at in your life, but it's weighing on you as an existential crisis. I'll never ever reduce my emails down to zero, or I'll never be able to learn all of this stuff. And the first thing is to let go of that.
And that's hard, isn't it, for people to accept that? The acceptance is a critical part of psychological flexibility, and being able to adapt to the future and know that actually you have to accept that the situation isn't maybe what you want it to be right now, but that you still have some level of influence, but it might be different tomorrow. And I think the problem I feel with that is that when so much is changing and you feel like you're having to adapt and flex all the time and constantly kind of look out for what's next, is that you can disengage slightly with the organization. You can disengage in order to protect yourself. And we see a lot of that kind of self-care, that like, right, fine, well, I'm going to have to shut off because this isn't good for me. But what we really need in organizations is people who are really still highly engaged, but able to go, okay, well, that was today. That wasn't quite what I thought was going to happen today, certainly not from this morning, but this is where we are now. And that's what it means for tomorrow. And I'm going to come back in tomorrow and focus on that instead with the same amount of energy. As you said, that energy piece is critical, isn't it? Because you really feel it when people are putting energy into something. You can feel it if a team's got energy, and you can feel it if they don't. And you know what you're talking about, even though you can't necessarily quantify what that is. It's that impact and that feeling. And I think we've got some a question coming here that we have here is from Kylie. Tell us. I think one of the barriers to developing workplace influences lies in the fact companies are very often short-handed. And when that's the case, those in charge are overwhelmed with their own responsibilities, for sure. Not necessarily in a position to observe and recognise the positive influencer tendencies. So peers are sometimes unaware. Peers are aware of who the influencers are, but not necessarily in a position to harness and further develop those characteristics. It's interesting, isn't it, as a reflection, because I've seen that in organisations. Have you noticed that in your?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about this from a capacity point of view, and you're saying, right, so now you've got this wonderful person who's capable of doing this, whatever skill set that they can bring to life with influencing others. You're now asking to do something on top of their job, and we have this collaboration overload problem that there's 15% of people in most organizations where there's an unrealistic expectation that they will be the lifesavers across loads of different collaborative efforts. So what the danger here is that we think about this as an additional job on top of something else.
100%. That really worries me, actually, is this, because I think that's essentially what we're doing with our champions and sponsors, is we're asking them to do a little bit on the edges, but actually what they're doing is so significant. My question is whether or not, is it a paid role? Is that?
Well, I think we do have to experiment to figure it out, because if you think about one of the potential kind of roles for an outlier, for an influencer, is to find the outliers in your organization, the people who are able to do things in spite of all the limitations. They're the people that manage to, figure things out when nobody's telling them. They manage to be more resilient. They manage to look after their health and do their job brilliantly and so on. And you can learn so much from those people because they are the ones that figured it out intuitively.
There's not that many of them, so they stand out, don't they?
But they are the ones that, they're the small percentage of the organization that people get polarized around as well, because some people love them and some people resent them.
Envious. They're just like, how do you manage to do that when I can't? And maybe there's different situations in their lives that mean that they can do that,
Yeah.
that other people maybe don't have the same privileges around. So it can be
They
really
could be, and some of them are, like I know one lady who's single mom, she's got 3 kids, she holds down this amazing, like linchpin job in an organization. She isn't paid that well. She has got the highest engagement scores in the organization. She basically works huge hours, loved by her team, loved by her customers, and so on. And look at other people in comparable roles, and it's nothing like it. So people ask, well, how does she manage to do that when everybody else? And she doesn't have any special privileges in doing that. She doesn't have any special help. She doesn't get any bonuses for doing this, and so on. So when you break it down, actually, it comes down to 3 or 4 choices that this person's making about how they manage themselves, how they set boundaries between different aspects of the life in a different way. And those lessons are just invaluable for people, because you need to feel them. You need to feel the connection with those things. They're not just like a cheat sheet where you can write down, here's the 3 things that she does that other people. You need to bring them to life.
And how can we do that now with the different ways of working that we have, and new generations influencing the whole organization differently with expectations, ways of thinking about the world? That in itself, we're seeing for the first time, aren't we, kind of the first wave of people becoming managers for the first time post-pandemic that never worked pre-pandemic, so haven't got any role models or experience necessarily to kind of look back on, and yet being brought back into the office, in an environment that they've not learned to be in, or what it's like to manage in, and they're back to basic skills, aren't they? Basic human skills, and that's what we get asked a lot around those.
Yeah. So I think you have to, again, separate mindset and skill set here.
Yeah.
There are things that we can just keep on forgetting that people need to learn for the first time in their careers. And a lot of the critique that senior managers have of junior people is that they've forgotten what it was like to be 25 and take on a management role. They've forgotten it, literally, and they're projecting their ambition and their level of knowledge and skills onto those people, and being quite critical of the fact that somebody who is completely out of their depth, no experience to draw upon, and little support, isn't perfect. There is an expectation of over expectation of perfection amongst these people, because they've got so much ambition and drive. They're expecting their maturity to match that, and it's never going to happen. I think from a mindset point of view, what we should be focused in on is what unites us. Because if we've got 5 generations of people, there's more in common than there is different. And that's what we should be focusing in on. And so what do we all have in common when we're with people who are different to us? And it's one really simple thing. We feel vulnerable. Whether you're 55 and you're the CEO of the organization, or you're the most junior person, you're feeling some form of vulnerability. And when we don't appreciate that, we don't acknowledge it in ourselves, then we act out. We act out in bad
I didn't
ways.
expect you to say vulnerability, so I'm sitting there trying to explore that in my head. Why is it vulnerability then?
Because look, right, so like I'm a white man, successful white man running a large organization, and then there's a whole group of people whose life experience I've never known about, and they're challenging me with our policies or some idea and a strategy, and I don't acknowledge that these people make me feel vulnerable, because I have to look strong, I have to be right, I have to be the certain person. And so my mindset is actually more influenced by my feelings of vulnerability than anything else. It's not about what I know, it's not about what I want to happen in the situation, it's not about the fact that I value you, appreciate you. It's more about my feelings of vulnerability. And when I don't acknowledge that, then everything else is off the table, because my reactions are all going to be trying to reclaim my sense of value, my sense of safety, my own thing. And that's often the thing that's playing out, and most people aren't being taught that.
Well, that's new for me. I'm sitting there I'm just trying to understand how vulnerability can be the thing that connects us all. Looked into a lot of different human connecting pieces around being interconnected, interdependent, but vulnerability didn't stand out as the big thing. So it's really kind of blown my mind a bit. I'm just kind of processing it and thinking, I should share with everybody as well your book. I want to make sure that I mention that whilst we've got people watching and listening and sharing with us. John was it was a best-selling author in New York with his book Leading in a Non-Linear World, which was only just released in 2022. So I'm imagining a lot of this is coming from your book. Why did you write the book? Tell me a bit more about that.
I think so. Probably about 20 years ago, when I was working a lot in Silicon Valley organizations like Google and eBay and so on, everybody was talking about mindset. And I started asking people what they meant by it. And so they would say one of two things. They'd either draw upon Carol Dweck's work, or they would just come up with their own definition of it. And it was always different. And it wasn't actionable. It was almost like a label that we're attaching to people, and that's not what mindset is. It's not.
And it encompasses everything, doesn't it? Just one word to mean so much.
Yeah, and so people regard it as supremely important in the ability of somebody to be included, to be valuable, to contribute, and so on. But if you don't have a definition for something, then and you're placing a label on, which is unhelpful. So I then spent 10 years researching what mindset was, and I pieced together from various forms of neuroscience and psychology all these different components that are all in separate elements. So the new neuroscience around emotion and affect, which is our physical feelings, things like interoception, which is our capacity to pay attention to our own signals, metacognition, which is our ability to think about our thoughts, to understand how other people see us, and so on, and build this kind of understanding of how these processes all work together to formulate our mindset. So, being a scientist, that's where I kind of started my life. I wanted to understand it from that point of view, because I was looking at it in a system perspective and recognizing this is increasingly becoming how we're defining ourselves. Our mindset is becoming so important. And then I think, I started to consider, like, what is past the knowledge economy? We talked about the fourth industrial revolution and so on, but that's kind of like the infrastructure and so on. But what are actually human beings doing in that environment? And it just dawned on me that what's actually happening is that more and more industries, more and more jobs, more and more aspirations is not about skills. It's about me as a person, and the value that I bring as a human being into the world. And that's what's happening now. We're starting to see, like trillion-dollar economies forming around this mindset economy. So that's kind of what I was really interested in. And so in the book, it's basically two things. It's the science of mindset, and then it's like, how do you apply that in the real world?
And I love that piece that you're saying about it's not about skills. It's really about who we are and the value that we personally bring as an individual, kind of unique individual in this planet, but also the connection then that we have to all human beings. So it's like there's these lovely, like, I guess, ways of connecting that all together. And it's helpful to be able to categorize it like that and think about it that way. And it automatically leads me to kind of some of the typical HR questions, I guess, around, okay, so how can you recruit for mindset, and how's that different to attitude, and how do we measure that with behaviours, and all those great questions that we get when we start thinking about something in more depth, and how does it apply to the organization? So how would you say it applies to the organization? What's the most important thing kind of from your research around mindset to an organization?
So the most important thing is actually mindset leaders.
Okay.
Because the thing that is at the heart of mindset, from a asset point of view, my asset and my mindset is these various forms of self-awareness, the capacity to be able to think about myself, to understand my needs, and to understand how that plays out in relationships, in my work, and so on. The reality is that you have a kind of trap that bright people fall into, the intelligence trap, which is the more intelligent you are, the more likely you are to confuse knowing and doing. So
knowing and doing.
Yeah.
Right,
so self-awareness is really about the ability to close the gap between what I know and what I'm doing to get what I want, or to get what I'm accountable for. So true accountability in leadership is about closing known and doing gaps. So if you've got really intelligent people who have got low self-awareness, and because those are two independent variables, intelligence and self-awareness are independent, the way in which organizations are solving in that moment is wrong. They're teaching people self-awareness based on things like emotional intelligence and personality tests and so on. They're brilliant for self-knowledge, but self-knowledge is not the same as self-awareness. Self-awareness is the ability to monitor myself in the moment. Self-knowledge is, I know this about myself. So I have this Hogan report or something like that, every 3 or 4 years. And I can tick the box. Oh yeah, that's who I am. That's my identity. That's my knowledge of my values and my personality types. That doesn't do anything in the moment to help me monitor myself in relationship to my task, my ownership of an outcome, or my relationships with other people. So we're developing a test. It's probably the world's first commercial test available in this area to kind of help people figure out those knowing doing gaps across different dimensions of their leadership. And essentially it does a number of things. One is it gives you an actionable agenda, but the other thing is it helps organizations to stop promoting smart jerks.
Smart jerks being promoted. Okay, that's going to stick with me now. Because we work in all organisations are full of individual contributors who are highly intelligent, specialised, technical in their field, and absolute genius.
Yeah.
And typically, when we look at kind of emotional intelligence, human intelligence, we see the ability to know themselves really high, and then automatically apply what they know to everyone else, without considering what is this collective knowledge that I'm missing. What's the understanding of others and how they operate? But exactly that, and in their knowing and doing, how do I support them to understand the gaps too? Because as a leader, you're the ones that work with and through others, and you need to be the person that translates and supports and encourages and invites people into that conversation. So so I agree with you around the leadership piece. It's absolutely fundamental, but I'm interested to see whether influencers become kind of more leaders in that space. Has that automatically happened by accident over the years, where people have noticed, or actually is it something that we are fundamentally developing in our leadership programs and in our approaches and organizations? I mean, that's another whole conversation.
Well, influence is power. So one of the things that like new organizational power is going to be reshaped by influence. So if you've got a number of people in your organization who have created an audience and expectation of for information, for opinions, for guidance and navigation, you've now ceded a lot of power to those people. If they don't have the awareness to take the responsibility for the power they wield in the organization, you've got a problem. Much in the same way as you have very intelligent leaders with low self-awareness, you've got a problem because they encourage bad behavior. They don't necessarily always hold people accountable to outcomes and so on. So you'll create the same set of problems with poor self-awareness if you give influencers a lot of power, or if they create a lot of power for themselves.
So we need to be careful then with influencers.
I think it's something to be watched for.
Careful. We need to allow them to emerge, discover, build, support, but also ensure that we're building that capability across our leadership populations, supporting people to understand each other and build on those 5 different core areas that you mentioned. There's a lot to be focusing on, isn't there? But I think it gives us hope that actually there's a lot that we can do in organizations, and we don't need to default to the computers. We can do, as humans, amazing things that actually really give us that advantage, not just competitively in a commercial environment, but that advantage to feel like we're really fulfilled and thriving in our lives too. So I think there's a lot there for us as humans, but as well as the organizations that we're operating within, particularly if we're being asked to do more with less. Turning to the intentional aspects of the organizations that we can influence is going to be key. And I think we've pretty much come to the end of our time today, and I've absolutely thoroughly enjoyed this conversation so much. I've forgotten to share our human skills link, which I think Mike's going to share now if he hasn't already. Yes, we've got the QR code there to some of the human skills courses that we have available. If anyone's interested in exploring more of those, we can get in touch. We're also we have another exciting event coming up in March that is going to be several people joining me to have a really great discussion on leadership. So watch out for the links that are going to be released over the next few days. And I'm really hoping that we can carry on this conversation, John, because there's so many different questions I have to ask you. But please do feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat. Very happy to continue answering those after we've finished here today. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation. I hope you've valued listening in, watching, and being part of it with us, with hundreds of leaders and people in all industries and organizations across the world. We've got over 400 registered on this one today, and hoping to hear some some of the feedback about what it sparked for you in your organisation. What are you thinking about in terms of your organisational workplace influences? Are you developing them? Are you discovering them? Are you thinking about how you can influence your internal comms to consider different ways of working across organisational populations? But thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to our next session, and thank you so much, John. I've thoroughly enjoyed this session today. It's been fantastic to have a great conversation.